Hi, Clive Stafford-Smith. Welcome to 10 by 6.
Well, thank you for having me on 10 by 6.
Clive is a multi-award winning human rights lawyer and author. And what I suggest you do, because obviously time constraints, is to go onto his Wikipedia page and find out all about him. Personally, I came across Clive first when he was part of a documentary in 1987.
Oh, you're showing your age, aren't you?
Absolutely. 14 Days in May, which was absolutely amazing. And I know that you also did, which I haven't seen, I don't think, a follow-up in which you did your own investigation.
Yeah, it's called The Journey, and we tracked down the guy who probably did it. You know, poor Edward Johnson had been executed for something that he patently didn't do, and I'd represented him. So, you know, if I can get an innocent person executed, so can anyone.
Yes. No, absolutely. But as I suggest to people, one, go on your Wikipedia page, two, check out the books that you've written, both about Guantanamo and about the American legal system. And interesting, before we move on to the main topic.
No, ironically, can I just say, you might be able to pick up a telephone in the background. If you can, that noise is Marita Maharaj calling. She calls about this time every day. And she's the 81-year-old wife of Chris Maharaj, who is another of my clients, who I wrote a book about called Injustice, about all the problems in the justice system. So it's very appropriate. I'm sorry, I'm not talking to her. I'll have to call her back.
No, that's amazing. No, yeah, thank you. I was just going to say that one of the conclusions you make in the book about injustice is that you actually believe that the UK criminal justice system is now worse than the US one. And our focus today, really, I think, I want it to be on how you would create a fit for purpose criminal justice system, both in the US and both in the UK. So sort of over to you now.
Sure, no, I'll be glad to. I mean, it's a sad moment to say you'd rather be in Mississippi than Manchester, but I'm afraid it's true. But there's a lot of things that are similar about the American and the British system in terms of them both being unfit for purpose. And I suppose that in the end was the subject of the book I wrote about Chris and Marita. And, you know, you begin with basic things. Unless we recognize the problem, we can't find a solution. The first problem is that pretty much everyone in the justice system's in the wrong job. So if, for example, Jason, I was to ask you, do you want to be a police officer? What would you say?
No.
Why not? Would you like putting people in prison? Would you be worried about having the power? What?
Personally, I don't see myself wanting to be an authoritarian agent of the state.
This is exactly why you would actually probably make quite a good cop, because you've used exactly the word. It's interesting that most police officers reflect what's called the authoritarian personality, and it doesn't make them evil people. It means they believe in the system. And if they believe in the system, they believe the system gets it right. And so I had a couple of cops come to my house on a thing not long ago, and I was just chatting with them, nice chaps from the Metropolitan Police. And I asked them how often in 54 years between them, they'd made a mistake, they thought, where they maybe got the wrong guy. And neither of them paused for a breath. Oh, never. And I thought, oh, come on, you know, we've got papal infallibility over here. Now we've got police infallibility. I could not persuade them in 54 years between them that they'd ever made a mistake. That's terrifying, because of course they have. And yet that is the personality of the people who become police officers. So I'm voting for you to become one. That's the first one. The second problem is basically the judges. The people in this country, my goodness, you know, I went to a private school and I'm still recovering. And 74% of judges in Britain went to private schools. They have no idea about the real world out there. I was having dinner with a bunch of judges recently, and I asked them, you know, how sure do you have to be before you bang someone up in prison? And, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt, they thought on average, they came down at 83% sure. Well, come on, you know, there are 6 million people in the American judicial system. That means they're aiming to put 1 million innocent people in prison. And just listening to them talk, they have no idea about how juries really work, about how the system really works. And this was epitomized in a case my wife did recently, the Freshwater Five off the Isle of Wight, where these judges, and I'm sorry, I was about to say these idiot judges, opined about what the jurors thought. Well, number one, they've made it a criminal offense for us to ask the jurors what they thought, which is silly because we can do that in America. And number two, one of the jurors already said what he thought, which is the guys are innocent. And they're just totally wrong. They've got these five guys doing 104 years who are clearly not guilty. And these guys are arguing over the number of angels who can dance on the head of a pin. And, you know, then there are other aspects. The defendant, we just don't get how dangerous the innocent defendant is. You know, look, Jason, did you murder two people in the DuPont Plaza Hotel in 1987? Yes or no? Did you?
No.
Well, who did it? You don't know. You're just useless, right?
No, exactly.
You're useless. And you say you're innocent. You know, you're totally useless to me, whereas someone who's guilty is quite helpful. But then I ask you, do you want to go to trial tomorrow or in about 2 years when I've had time to prepare? You say tomorrow. Do you want to spend 20 grand on a defense or 2 million on a defense? Well, you know, I'm innocent, so I'm just spend 20 grand. And this is what Chris Maharaj did. And he couldn't believe that he could be found guilty by 12 reasonable people for a crime he didn't do. When they did convict him, because he had a useless defense lawyer, he passed out, he fainted. The innocent defendant, we totally misjudge how dangerous the innocent defendant is to himself. Then you get to so-called science in a courtroom. When I was young, I was a scientist. And going into courtrooms, oh my God. You think about something like shaken baby syndrome. The British system is way worse than the Americans, at least in the US. We get to challenge these things effectively. In the UK, I was working with Dr. Wayne Squire, who was a doctor who dared to consider that maybe shaken baby syndrome is not a real syndrome. And they tried to strike her off the GMC for daring to disagree with other people. It was like, you know, saying that actually the sun revolves around the earth. You know, you're going to get burned at the stake. Shaken baby syndrome, just between you and me, Jason, is bogus. It just doesn't exist. And yet we've sentenced hundreds of people to prison for it based on a theory that was first propounded by a British guy who died a couple of years back, having said, I didn't mean that, you know, this is nonsense. I didn't mean this at all. So you have all of these things that go on in a courtroom that are just nonsense. And yet we think it all works together rather well. And then you look at the British system. In America, at least, we have openness. We get the prosecution file, we get the file of the police, we get all of this different stuff. In Britain, if you're in prison for something you didn't do, you don't even get a transcript of the trial. We've had that in America since 1936. You know, you never get the prosecution file, you never get the police file, you're not allowed to talk to certain witnesses. You can't go to court on an appeal, you have to go to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, who, sad to say, are a pretty hopeless lot. In Britain, you know, I really would rather be in Mississippi if I was challenging my conviction. So we've got all of these problems, and yet the British are sitting there rather piously thinking we have the best system in the world. We don't. We have a dreadful system for judging people. The only good thing you can say about the British system is we're not yet as harsh as the American system, and we don't have a few of the maddest things that we also have in America, like electing judges, for goodness sake. But it's a really, really dreadful system. And then you have to think about, well, why are we doing this? You know, so we can put someone in prison, mistreat him or her a bit more, and make sure that when they come out of prison, they're even worse off. You know, the thing that drove me mad this week is I've got a friend, a client of my wife's coming to stay, who has just been exonerated through DNA, thankfully, only thanks to Emily, no thanks to the CCRC, who refused to do it. He was meant to do 7 years. He did 17 years because he refused to show remorse and take responsibility for his crime because he was innocent. And he still hasn't been exonerated because everyone's twiddling their thumbs while Rome burns. But, you know, the idea...
This isn't new, is it? I mean, sorry, no problem. This isn't new because, I mean, if you watch, for example, the episode of Porridge with Blanco. It's exactly the same thing in the 1970s. You've got to sit there and say you did it for them to, move on to the.
Yeah, really. And then if you are innocent, you can't get any compensation. I don't know if I locked you up for 17 years, how much you'd want to be paid. We just got couple of guys out in America, and they were paid $1 million for each year they were locked up. So it came out to $35 million. I wouldn't swap a year of freedom for $1 million, frankly. And I certainly wouldn't swap 20 years of freedom for 20 million. Just think what you'd missed. But in Britain, you don't even get compensation unless you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, effectively, you're innocent. And if you do that, you know what? They bill you for the time you spent in prison, the meals and, the 4 hots and a cot sort of thing. They bill you for having given you bad food in prison for God knows how many years. There are all of these things. No one knows this stuff. And we all sit there calmly thinking that everything's hunky-dory. And it's not. And that's why your listeners and you, sorry, Jason, and you should devote the rest of your life to helping me out so we can we can get a little justice for these people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just simply wasn't aware of that. That is just astonishing.
I'm afraid I've only just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Of course.
I wouldn't tell you to buy my book Injustice, because you should steal it from your local bookshop. But otherwise, you can always send me a note and I'll send you one. But, the only reason I came to the recognition of a lot of these flaws was I knew I'd failed Chris for all these years. I've represented him since 1993. And I just wanted to make myself feel guilty, so I'd do some more work on this case. And I started analyzing, how could I have lost this case? I know who did it. It's not just that Chris didn't do it. I know who did do it. It's the cartels did it. Do you want me to tell you a really bad story?
Go for it.
Oh, yeah. What do you remember from the movie Fargo?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
What do you remember? What's the scene you remember from Fargo?
In terms of the film, it's a while since I've seen the film. The actual
series. If I just tell you
please.
that the cop is coming through the woods and she sees the guy who's just murdered the other guy, and he's chopping him up in the wood chipper, and there's blood all over the snow. You remember that scene?
Yeah.
Well, I was in Medellin, right, Colombia. And the guy who really did the murder that Chris Maharaj was sentenced to death for, this guy called Cuchilla, meaning the blade, his real name's Zuluaga. And he was a hitman for Pablo Escobar. And he was murdered by Los Pepes, who were trying to kill Escobar. So they kidnapped Cuchilla. They torture him to try to find out where Escobar is. He doesn't know. And then this guy I'm talking to says, and then we said to him, Cuchilla, you obviously don't know where Escobar is. Well, now, Cuchilla, it is time for you to die. How would you like to die? And Cuchilla was taken aback, and, he'd murdered 300 people himself. He said, that's not how we used to do it. And this guy I'm talking to says, Cuchilla, this was just a little joke of mine. And then they fed the poor guy through a wood chipping machine, but he was alive when he went in, feet first, and not so alive when he came out. And these were the people who did the murder, the cartels. I've got 6 of them on record saying they did the murder. And the US government still won't let Chris go, which is, an illustration of the madness of the American system. But it's the same here for my wife's clients who didn't do what they're accused of too. No one went through a wood chipping machine on the Isle of Wight, as far as I know. But after that, the parallels begin.
Yeah. Can I just ask you obviously we're limited with time, just to sum up a little bit, if you could identify, say, 3 to 5 things that you would do to improve the US and UK criminal justice system right now, if you did have that dictatorial opportunity, what would you do?
Well, I would force the cops to have soppy liberals overlooking their shoulders the whole time, simply to question whether what they're doing was getting the right person, and just to ask questions, that's all, so that there wasn't this assumption that we always get it right. I'd get rid of pretty much all the judges we've got right now, and only accept applications from judges who have some sense both of what it means to judge a person beyond a reasonable doubt, but also who understand how people live in the real world. And I would totally open up the jury system, so you don't just take 12 people. You have the American system, which is 1,000 times better, where you get to learn a bit about the jurors before they're selected. And then the jurors can talk to people afterwards if they have questions. They can talk throughout the trial if they have questions. And that it's totally open. It's not perfect, but it's totally open. And then you're being judged by people who you know a bit and who know you a bit, and it's just a vastly better system. So I'd open it all up and make disclosure. I don't understand why they don't disclose everything to the person on trial. You know, what do you got to hide? Just disclose everything. If you got something you think is really sensitive, then maybe you don't have to, but otherwise everything should be disclosed, because that should be the rule. And you know, then the longer term, I would seriously question whether prison does anyone any good. But we may have to take this in baby steps.
Yes. And one other thing that tends to come through with programs that I watch, is that the accessibility to the best lawyers, and you mentioned it
well
earlier.
That's totally true, and that's one area where perhaps it's not quite as bad in this country as it is in America. In the US, you know, look, we were paid $1,000 to do an entire capital case. I sued them under the federal minimum wage law because they were paying us less than $1 an hour. Not that I don't do it for money, certainly, but you get what you pay for. And the people I went to law school all went to go work for some corporate law firm representing people over pointless contracts between corporations. You know, it's just really sad that those talented people don't help the people out who really need them. In this country, it's not quite as bad, because you don't just get the bottom feeders doing the most difficult death penalty cases. But at the same time, we constantly have people like Priti Patel behaving as if, we shouldn't be paying these lawyers to represent someone where the government's trying to throw you in prison. I mean, that's just total madness. But we need to change the attitude in Britain. I mean, this whole barrister business where they're all chummy and they're all trying to narrow down what the issues are. No, when you're assessing someone, you do it the American way, which is you look at the whole picture and you give the jurors the entire picture, not some slimmed down thing that a bunch of barristers think is all the people need to hear. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone on much too long.
No, not at all. And what a point you make in your book, especially in the US system, I'm not sure about the UK system, is that a lot of the upper middle class lawyers tend to be much more attracted to corporate law because there's so much more money in it than they are with the criminal law. So I guess a way of incentivizing the best lawyers to stay in criminal law, would that be something as well?
Well, you certainly want to do that, although in reality, actually, criminal law is so much more interesting. I think most people would like to do that. We disincentivize people by giving them all these student loans, for example. So people come out of with a law degree with not just an undergraduate student loans, but then their graduate student loans, and they owe huge amounts of money. And so it disincentivizes them from doing things that don't make a lot of money. You know, I'm not saying that people should get monumentally wealthy doing this, because frankly, lawyers are overrated massively. I'm quite sure we could say the same about journalists, but, really we should pay much more people to the people of the NHS and much less to the lawyers. But nevertheless, we need to incentivize people to do the right sort of law.
Yeah. Fantastic. This has been amazing. Thank you very much, Clive. And I'm sure hopefully soon, as possibly we can, we get you back onto the show and talk about other aspects, because it's just absolutely riveting and fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My great pleasure. My great pleasure.